Snake River Valley, Idaho Territory, April 1872. While neighboring homesteaders spent March and April splitting cedar logs for conventional fences, Henrik Larsen was doing something that made absolutely no sense. He was planting sticks in the ground, not building with wood, planting it. Live willow cuttings, thousands of them, pressed into muddy trenches around his 40-acre claim, while his neighbors watched with growing bewilderment and open ridicule. Thomas Brennan, whose split-rail fence already stood 8 rails high around his adjoining property, shook his head every time he passed Henrik's boundary line. Brennan's fence had consumed 4,000 board feet of cedar, required 6 weeks of hard labor, and followed the standard frontier construction that had served 3 generations of Irish settlers from Virginia to Montana Territory. It was a proper fence. Henrik's alternative consisted of 12,000 willow whips, each 18 to 24 inches long, planted 6 inches apart in double rows that looked like nothing more than mud-covered twigs poking up from wet soil. The visual absurdity was stark. Brennan's fence stood 5 feet tall, its split cedar rails interlocked in the proven pattern that kept livestock contained and provided some measure of security against predators. Henrik's so-called fence barely reached 3 inches above ground by late April, a pathetic collection of living sticks that a rabbit could step over without breaking stride. The community's expert voices united in dismissive judgment. Thomas Brennan, who had built 47 miles of split-rail fencing throughout Montana Territory, called it Scandinavian foolishness. "A man doesn't plant a fence," he declared to anyone within earshot. "He builds one with proper lumber that stands up the day it's finished." Jacob Morrison, the settlement's founder and former Army quartermaster whose logistics experience had established the Snake River Valley community in 1869, calculated the resource waste with military precision. Morrison had surveyed Henrik's property and determined that a standard 40-acre perimeter required approximately 800 split rails. Henrik was planting 12,000 individual cuttings. The mathematics seemed to prove the Norwegians' impracticality. Charles Whitney, a Harvard-educated New Englander who had brought Eastern sophistication to the Idaho frontier, viewed the entire enterprise as primitive superstition that educated Americans had long since abandoned in favor of rational construction methods. He told his wife Eleanor that Henrik would learn the hard way about American practicality versus old country folklore. Maria Kowalski, the Polish sheep rancher, whose property bordered Henrik's northern boundary, worried about more immediate concerns than cultural differences. The local wolf pack, estimated at 12 to 15 animals, had killed 40 sheep throughout the valley during the previous winter. Maria's rams represented substantial investment and her family's economic survival. She watched Henrik, planting his willow shoots with genuine anxiety. "Wolves don't wait for trees to grow," she told Martha Brennan during their weekly gathering at Morrison's trading post. "Those twigs won't stop a determined pack for 5 minutes." The economic criticism carried particular weight in a community where every homesteader operated on minimal cash reserves and maximal labor requirements. Morrison calculated that Henrik had spent 8 full weeks on fence planting, time that other settlers had used to prepare spring crops, repair winter damage to cabins and outbuildings, and complete the dozen other essential tasks that frontier survival demanded. Brennan had finished his fence in 6 weeks and moved on to field preparation. Henrik was still pressing willow cuttings into mud when his neighbors were planting wheat and potatoes. The settlement's informal evening gatherings, where men discussed progress and shared concerns, increasingly featured Henrik's project as cautionary example. Morrison predicted that Henrik would regret his waste of prime planting season when autumn came and his crop yields fell short. Whitney suggested the Norwegian should have brought common sense from Scandinavia along with his carpentry tools and Lutheran stubbornness. Henrik offered little defense beyond brief, quiet explanations that revealed knowledge sources his neighbors didn't recognize or respect. "In Norway, we fence with what grows back," he told Brennan during one conversation. "A living fence repairs itself." The comment seemed to confirm Whitney's assessment of old-world superstition rather than practical frontier wisdom. By late May 1872, conventional fences stood complete and livestock ready throughout the Snake River Valley. Henrik Larsen's property remained surrounded by thousands of willow shoots, barely 3 inches tall, a fence that couldn't stop a rabbit, much less the wolves that would return for summer hunting. June 15, 1872, brought the reality check that conventional frontier fencing could not deliver on its implied promise of predator protection. Thomas Brennan discovered 3 of his cattle dead at dawn, their throats torn open by wolves that had squeezed through the 12-inch gaps between his split rails during the night. The fence that had consumed 6 weeks of labor and 4,000 board feet of cedar had functioned perfectly for livestock containment, but offered virtually no barrier against determined predators. Wolves, it turned out, could slip their bodies through openings that seemed impossibly narrow, and Brennan's standard frontier fence featured dozens of such openings along its half-mile perimeter. The incident forced an uncomfortable recognition throughout the settlement. They had built fences designed to keep cattle in, not to keep wolves out. Henrik's willow shoots, meanwhile, continued their steady but unimpressive growth through the warm June weeks. By mid-July, the cuttings had reached 14 to 18 inches in height, their leaves creating a low green border that marked his property boundary. The double-row planting configuration was creating density that became apparent upon close inspection, roughly 12 individual shoots per linear foot. But the overall effect remained laughably inadequate as a barrier. A child could step through Henrik's fence without breaking stride. A wolf wouldn't even slow down. Maria Kowalski, walking her property line where it adjoined Henrik's northern boundary, counted the willow stems and calculated that each one was separated from its neighbors by mere inches. Density at ground level, perhaps, but the shoots stood barely knee-high. She wondered if Henrik understood that wolves attacked livestock at throat level, not ankle level. What neighbors didn't notice, because it remained invisible beneath the soil surface, was the root development occurring throughout Henrik's fence line. Willow cuttings don't just grow upward. They send roots downward with aggressive determination, establishing anchor systems that reach 3 to 4 feet deep within their first growing season. These roots were networking underground, creating interconnected structures that would eventually make Henrik's fence nearly impossible to breach through digging. But in July 1872, this underground architecture remained hidden, and the visible evidence suggested continued foolishness rather than emerging wisdom. Henrik's response to his fence's obvious vulnerability involved a technique he hadn't mentioned during his initial planting. Throughout late July and into August, he wove supplementary barriers between the willow rows, using cut hawthorn branches and wild rose canes gathered from creek bottoms and hillsides. The woven brush layer, constructed 4 feet high and dense with thorns, created an immediate barrier that the growing willows would eventually replace. This secondary defense system represented additional labor that neighbors observed but dismissed as more wasted effort. Brennan, watching Henrik weave thorny branches through willow stems, told Morrison it was like watching a man bale water with a basket. The fundamental problem, Brennan insisted, was Henrik's refusal to build a proper fence in the first place. The night of August 3rd provided the first test of Henrik's combined willow and brush defense system. Maria Kowalski, unable to sleep during the hot evening, stood at her window and watched the wolf pack approach Henrik's southern fence line under moonlight bright enough to cast shadows. She counted 7 animals, their movements cautious as they tested the barrier's strength. The wolves approached the woven brush layer, pushed against it with their muzzles, and retreated when thorns pricked their faces and paws. After 15 minutes of testing various points along the fence, the pack abandoned Henrik's property and moved northeast toward Brennan's land. Kowalski heard Brennan's sheep begin screaming 20 minutes later. 2 ewes died before Brennan could reach his pasture with his rifle. The morning conversation at Morrison's trading post acknowledged Henrik's livestock had survived untouched, but attributed the outcome to fortunate timing rather than fence design. The wolves had simply tested Henrik's property first and found Brennan's more accessible, Morrison explained. Lucky circumstance, not superior construction. Charles Whitney pointed out that Henrik's willows remained obviously inadequate, still under 3 feet tall by late August, despite 4 months of growing. Winter frost would kill those saplings, Whitney predicted, and spring would reveal the foolishness of planting rather than building. The brush layer might provide temporary deterrent, but living wood wouldn't survive Idaho's harsh winters. By next April, Henrik would be starting over with conventional lumber like everyone else. Henrik's willow shoots reached 28 to 36 inches by September, their stems visibly thickening from thread width to pencil width diameter, their root systems spreading and deepening beneath the soil surface, where skeptical eyes couldn't measure progress or acknowledge structural development that would define the fence's future strength. November 1872 brought the first hard freeze to Snake River Valley, and Henrik's willow fence dropped every leaf within a week. The bare stems standing along his property line looked exactly like what Thomas Brennan had predicted they would become, dead sticks poking out of frozen ground. Brennan walked his fence line where it bordered Henrik's property and shook his head at the lifeless appearance of the willow shoots. Spring thaw would prove him right, he told his wife. Those sticks were finished. Jacob Morrison calculated that Henrik would need to purchase conventional lumber come April, probably 800 split rails at $2.50 per 100 board feet, plus 6 weeks of construction labor to build what he should have built the previous spring. Charles Whitney recorded in his journal that the Norwegian had learned an expensive lesson about the difference between Scandinavian climate and Idaho reality. December through February tested every fence in the settlement as heavy snow accumulated and ice storms struck with brutal regularity. Split rail fences throughout the valley suffered structural damage that revealed the hidden costs of conventional construction. Brennan lost 47 rails to breakage when snow loads exceeded the wood's tolerance, and frozen rails snapped rather than bent under pressure. The replacement lumber would cost him $31, and the repair work would consume 2 weeks of spring labor when he should be planting crops. Maria Kowalski's fence suffered worse damage when an ice storm in late January caused an entire 40-foot section to collapse completely. The rebuild required purchasing 120 new rails and dedicating 3 weeks to reconstruction. Morrison, documenting the winter damage throughout the community as part of his settlement records, calculated that conventional fences required an average of 15% rail replacement after each winter season. The ongoing material costs added $23 to $35 per homestead annually, expenses that frontier families could barely afford. Henrik's dormant willow fence stood through the same snow and ice without a single broken stem. The bare willow wood possessed a flexibility that split cedar lacked. When snow accumulated on the stems, they bent under the weight rather than snapping. When ice coated the branches, they bowed and flexed instead of breaking. The woven brush barrier layer remained intact throughout the winter, its thorny branches still forming an effective deterrent despite being covered in snow for weeks at a time. Henrik spent no money on fence repairs and no time on structural maintenance. His neighbors attributed this to luck rather than superior design, insisting the winter had been unusually mild despite the ice storms and prolonged freezing temperatures. What they couldn't see was the continued root development occurring beneath the frozen soil. Willow roots grow during winter dormancy whenever ground temperatures rise above 35 degrees Fahrenheit, and the Snake River Valley's variable winter weather provided dozens of such days. Henrik's fence was strengthening underground, while his neighbors' fences were deteriorating above ground. February 18, 1873, brought the crisis that would change the community's understanding of fence effectiveness. A wolf pack numbering 15 to 17 animals, driven desperate by winter food scarcity, entered the valley and began a systematic 3-night attack on every homestead's livestock. The pack's size represented the largest concentration of wolves in regional memory, and their hunger made them aggressive beyond normal predator caution. Brennan lost 6 cattle during the first night despite armed patrols and defensive fires. Kowalski lost 11 sheep on the second night when wolves dug under her rebuilt fence section and breached her pasture from an unexpected direction. Whitney lost 4 pigs on the third night after wolves simply jumped his 4-foot fence barrier and killed every animal in his pen before he could load his rifle. Henrik's property faced attack all 3 nights. Snow preserved the evidence of wolf activity along his entire fence line. Paw prints approached his willow and brush barrier at 4 separate locations, circled for extended periods, and retreated without penetrating the defense. The thorny brush layer proved too painful for the wolves to push through, and the dense willow growth, even in dormant winter condition, provided a secondary barrier with stems spaced so closely that wolf bodies couldn't squeeze between them. The double-row planting configuration that had seemed like wasteful redundancy in April now revealed its purpose. 12 willow shoots per linear foot meant 12 potential barriers that wolves would need to bypass, and the interwoven root systems prevented the digging strategy that had succeeded against Kowalski's conventional fence. 0 livestock died on Henrik's 40 acres during the February crisis. His cattle and sheep remained untouched, while the valley lost 34 animals to the wolf pack's desperate hunger. The morning after the third night's attacks, neighbors gathered at Henrik's fence line and examined the physical evidence preserved in snow. Scratch marks showed where wolves had tested the barrier. Digging attempts revealed where they had tried to tunnel under, but encountered root networks too dense to penetrate quickly. Blood on thorns indicated where the brush layer had wounded wolves, attempting to force entry. Thomas Brennan placed his hand on a dormant willow stem and felt its strength. The wood flexed under pressure, but didn't break, didn't snap, didn't fail. April 1873 answered the question of whether Henrik's willow stems had survived winter dormancy or died as Charles Whitney had predicted. Within 2 weeks of spring thaw, bright green buds appeared on every stem along the fence line, and by late April, the dormant wood exploded into vigorous growth that fundamentally changed the barrier's appearance and effectiveness. Second-year willow growth proceeded at rates that astonished neighbors accustomed to the static permanence of split-rail construction. The stems that had stood 28 to 36 inches tall in September now shot upward at 4 to 6 feet per season, their trunks thickening from pencil-width to thumb-width diameter as the established root systems delivered nutrients and water with remarkable efficiency. The double-row configuration created a wall effect 18 to 24 inches thick, and the leaf density provided visual barrier that made it impossible to see through the fence even before the willows reached their full height. Jacob Morrison began taking weekly measurements along Henrik's property line, documenting growth rates that seemed to violate his understanding of normal plant behavior. Henrik used the community's renewed interest to explain knowledge sources that had guided his unconventional approach from the beginning. In Norway and Sweden, he told the gathered neighbors, living fences had protected farms and livestock for more than 400 years. The technique wasn't primitive superstition, but practical engineering, refined through centuries of observation and adaptation. Willow species selection proved critical to success. Henrik had specifically sought Salix alba, white willow, and Salix viminalis, basket willow, because these varieties rooted from cuttings with 95% or better success rates in moisture-retentive soil. Their growth characteristics delivered 6 to 10 feet of vertical growth per year. Once root systems established, and individual trees could live 40 to 80 years with proper maintenance. The coppicing ability of willow meant that cutting the stems actually strengthened the fence rather than damaging it, causing multiple shoots to emerge from each cut trunk and creating even denser barriers over time. The underground root networking that had remained invisible throughout the previous year now revealed its structural importance. Willow roots growing from separate cuttings actually grafted together underground when they made contact, creating a unified network that functioned as a single organism rather than thousands of individual plants. This interconnected root system extended 6 to 8 feet deep by the fence's second year, making it nearly impossible for predators to dig under the barrier quickly enough to gain access before human intervention. The maintenance advantages became apparent through simple observation. Morrison's split-rail fence required 15% rail replacement annually at recurring material cost. Henrik's willow fence required periodic cutting to control height, but this pruning generated no costs and actually improved the barrier's density and strength. July 22, 1873, brought the decisive test that would eliminate all remaining skepticism about living fence effectiveness. A wolf pack, numbering 19 animals, the largest in regional memory, entered Snake River Valley, driven by prairie drought that had devastated their normal hunting territories. The pack moved through the settlement over 3 nights, systematically testing every homestead's defenses with the desperation of starving predators. Brennan's reinforced fence, rebuilt and strengthened after the February crisis, failed when wolves dug underneath the lowest rail and created an opening large enough for the entire pack to enter his pasture. Kowalski's newly rebuilt fence proved inadequate when 3 wolves jumped the barrier simultaneously, a coordinated attack that her defensive shooting couldn't prevent. Whitney armed his neighbors for organized patrols, but the wolves struck during the brief periods when exhausted men returned to their cabins for rest. Henrik's property faced the longest and most determined assault of the crisis. He watched from his cabin window as the pack spent 45 minutes testing his willow barrier at multiple points, attempting every breach strategy that had succeeded against conventional fences. The willows now stood 8 to 9 feet tall, too high for wolves to jump even with running starts. The root network prevented effective digging, with roots encountering resistance every 6 inches down to 8-foot depths. The dense growth pattern, now exceeding 12 stems per linear foot with second-year branching, prevented wolf bodies from penetrating the barrier despite repeated attempts. Scratch marks and fur caught on bark documented the intensity of their efforts, but the living fortress held without compromise. Dawn revealed the attack's outcome with mathematical precision. 9 sheep lay dead throughout the valley, killed on properties defended by conventional fencing and armed patrols. 0 animals died on Henrik's 40 acres, despite the extended assault by the largest and most desperate wolf pack the region had ever faced. The community gathered at Henrik's fence that morning and examined the physical evidence of the night's battle. Thomas Brennan touched the living barrier and felt the density of growth that made penetration impossible. Morrison calculated the economics of 0 livestock losses versus the replacement costs that other families now faced. Charles Whitney, whose Harvard education had taught him to revise conclusions when evidence demanded it, spoke the words that marked the community's transformation. "This isn't superstition," he said quietly. "This is engineering. We didn't understand." Maria Kowalski asked the question that would reshape Snake River Valley's future. Can we still plant willows this season, or must we wait until next spring? September 1873 marked the beginning of a knowledge transfer that would transform frontier fencing throughout the Idaho Territory and beyond. Henrik conducted his first community workshop in the techniques that had seemed so foolish 18 months earlier, teaching neighbors to recognize the specific characteristics that made certain willow cuttings succeed while others failed. Cutting selection required understanding that late summer dormant wood, harvested in 18 to 24-inch lengths from healthy parent trees, rooted with far greater reliability than spring cuttings or wood taken from stressed plants. Species identification proved equally critical. Not all willows possessed the aggressive rooting behavior and rapid growth rates that frontier conditions demanded. Henrik walked the settlement's creek bottoms with interested neighbors, teaching them to recognize Salix alba by its lance-shaped leaves and silver-backed foliage, and Salix viminalis by its long, narrow leaves and straight stem growth. Soil requirements favored moisture-retentive ground, ideally within 200 feet of creek or river access, though irrigation could substitute for natural water sources. timing controlled success rates more than any other factor. Planting during dormancy, from November through March, allowed cuttings to establish root systems before spring growth demanded energy for leaf production. Thomas Brennan became the first convert, planting 2,000 willow cuttings along his southern property line in October 1873. He maintained his split-rail fence as backup protection, unwilling to trust completely in a system that still required years to reach full effectiveness. But his willingness to invest 8 weeks of autumn labor represented a profound reversal from the man who had called Henrik foolish for planting sticks. Maria Kowalski planted 3,500 cuttings around her sheep pasture borders in November, adding the supplementary woven brush layer that Henrik recommended for immediate predator deterrence, while the willows established themselves. Her decision carried particular weight because sheep ranching depended on predator protection more than cattle operations, and her public adoption of living fences influenced other livestock producers throughout the valley. Jacob Morrison approached Willow, planting as an experimental trial rather than full commitment, documenting 500 cuttings with detailed weekly measurements that tracked growth rates, survival percentages, and structural development. His methodical data collection served the community's need for quantified evidence that could justify the substantial labor investment that living fences required. Morrison's journals recorded soil moisture levels, temperature variations, and growth correlations that would guide future planners throughout the region. Charles Whitney initially refused to abandon conventional methods despite the July wolf crisis, citing 200 years of proven American frontier fencing practices that had served settlers from Massachusetts to Montana. His resistance lasted until January 1874, when a catastrophic ice storm destroyed 67% of his split-rail fence structure in a single night. The storm's damage cost Whitney $340 in replacement lumber and 8 weeks of labor during the season when he should have been preparing for spring planting. Emergency temporary fencing required an additional $60 in materials to prevent livestock escape during the Reconstruction period. 3 of his cattle wandered through gaps in the damaged fence and died from exposure before he could locate them in heavy snow. The cumulative cost of maintaining conventional fencing through a single severe weather event exceeded the total labor investment that living fences required over their entire establishment period. By February 1874, Whitney requested 4,000 willow cuttings from Henrik and began planting his entire property perimeter with what he called grudging acceptance of a superior solution. His personal journal, kept with the disciplined notation that Harvard had taught him, contained an entry dated February 18, 1874, that captured the transformation. Pride is expensive. Practicality is profitable. A man who refuses to learn from evidence is a fool, regardless of his education. Morrison's comprehensive 3-year survey, completed in 1876, documented the measurable differences between conventional and living fence systems with mathematical precision that eliminated subjective debate. Conventional split-rail fences required annual maintenance averaging 12 to 18% rail replacement throughout the valley, translating to $28 per year per homestead in material costs alone. Winter damage caused consistent structural failures that demanded emergency repairs during the season when labor was most valuable for other essential tasks. Predator protection remained minimal, with wolves breaching split-rail barriers regularly through gaps, digging, or jumping. The expected lifespan of conventional fencing averaged 12 to 15 years before complete reconstruction became necessary, a timeline that meant most homesteaders would rebuild their entire fence systems 2 to 3 times during their occupancy. Living willow fences, now protecting 7 homesteads throughout the settlement, required annual maintenance, limited to pruning for height control, work that actually strengthened the barriers rather than merely maintaining them. Material costs averaged $0 per year, with labor requirements of approximately 8 hours annually per homestead. Winter damage registered as non-existent because willow flexibility prevented the breakage that destroyed rigid wooden rails. Predator protection achieved 100% effectiveness against wolves and coyotes across all properties using established living fences. Expected lifespan remained unknown because the fences continued growing stronger rather than deteriorating. But Norwegian examples documented functional barriers 40 to 80 years old. The additional economic benefit that Morrison noted with particular interest involved the annual harvest of willow cuttings from established fences, which settlers sold to newcomers for $3 to $5 per thousand, creating income from maintenance activity that conventional fencing could never generate. By 1880, living willow fences surrounded 43 homesteads throughout Idaho Territory, according to official land survey documents that tracked frontier development and agricultural improvements. The technique that Henrik Larsen had introduced to Snake River Valley 8 years earlier had spread westward into Oregon Territory, eastward across Wyoming, and northward through Montana, as settlers shared knowledge through correspondence, personal visits, and the informal networks that connected frontier communities across vast distances. A United States Department of Agriculture report published in 1884 made specific reference to Scandinavian living fence methods gaining acceptance in Western territories, noting improved cold weather livestock survival rates and reduced timber consumption in regions where willow fencing had replaced conventional split rail construction. Commercial willow cutting operations established themselves near major settlements, selling prepared cuttings to homesteaders who lacked access to natural willow populations or couldn't spare the time required for gathering and preparing planting material. Jacob Morrison became a regional consultant, traveling to new settlements throughout Idaho and Wyoming to teach proper construction techniques and troubleshoot problems that inexperienced planters encountered. The economic impact reached beyond individual homesteads to affect territorial resource management. Settlers adopting living fences saved an average of $35 to $50 annually in fence maintenance costs, money that frontier families could redirect toward land improvement, livestock expansion, or the 100 other investments that homestead success demanded. The reduced pressure on timber resources proved equally significant in regions where accessible forests couldn't sustain the ongoing harvest that conventional fencing required. Henrik's original 1872 fence entered its mature phase during the 1890s, the willow trees now reaching 18 to 20 feet in height and requiring annual coppicing to maintain the 10 to 12-foot functional barrier that livestock management and predator protection demanded. The pruned wood found ready markets as basket-making material, generating additional income that Henrik calculated at $40 to $60 annually, enough to pay his property taxes with surplus remaining for other expenses. Second-generation improvements emerged as experienced planters adapted the basic technique to local conditions and specific needs. Mixed species planting combined willow's rapid growth with hawthorn's superior thorn density, creating barriers that provided both structural strength and enhanced predator deterrence. Drier regions experimented with cottonwood varieties that tolerated lower moisture levels while still offering the aggressive rooting behavior that living fences required. The structural evolution of decades-old fences revealed characteristics that original planters hadn't anticipated. Willow trunks measuring 8 to 12 inches in diameter created nearly impenetrable walls, their interconnected root systems preventing erosion and stabilizing soil on sloped terrain. Unexpected benefits included wildlife habitat that supported beneficial bird populations, and windbreak properties that protected crops and reduced heating costs for nearby structures. The year 1912 marked the 40th anniversary of Henrik's initial planting and attracted academic interest from agricultural researchers, documenting innovative frontier practices. A formal study team visited Snake River Valley in September 1912 to examine and measure the original fence that had generated 4 decades of regional transformation. Henrik Larsen's 1872 willow barrier remained fully functional with 0 structural failures across its entire perimeter. Trunk measurements recorded individual trees with diameters reaching 14 inches, their root systems so thoroughly interconnected that researchers couldn't determine where one tree ended and another began. The comparison property study provided mathematical vindication of Henrik's approach. Thomas Brennan's homestead, now operated by his son Michael after Thomas's death in 1904, had required complete fence reconstruction 3 times during the 40-year period, in 1879, 1893, and 1907. The cumulative cost over 4 decades totaled $847 in materials and labor, not counting the countless hours spent on annual maintenance and emergency repairs. Henrik's fence had cost 8 weeks of initial labor in 1872, plus approximately 8 hours annually for pruning, translating to roughly $45 in labor equivalent over the entire 40-year span. The livestock protection record showed 0 predator breaches on Henrik's property across 4 decades of wolf, coyote, and occasional bear activity. Valley-wide adoption had reached 89% by 1912, with living fences protecting the vast majority of homesteads, while conventional split-rail construction survived only on properties owned by the most stubborn traditionalists or recent arrivals not yet educated in superior methods. Henrik Larsen, now 69 years old and still operating his original homestead with help from 2 grown sons, reflected on the journey from mockery to vindication during an interview conducted for the academic study. Norwegians learned centuries ago that working with nature produces better results than fighting against it, he explained. A fence you build eventually fails and requires replacement. A fence you grow becomes stronger every year. The community that had called him foolish for planting sticks now taught his techniques to every newcomer, and the Snake River Valley had gained regional recognition as the settlement with living fences. Michael Brennan, splitting rails for a small storage pen behind his barn, acknowledged the transformation his own family had experienced. My father spent his entire life replacing broken rails and calculating lumber costs, he told the researchers. I spend mine pruning willows and selling the cuttings for extra income. The difference isn't just economic, it's philosophical. The final documentation captured in a 1912 photograph showed Henrik's original fence as a massive wall of interwoven willow trees, their trunks forming an impenetrable barrier that had protected livestock through 40 winters, stopped countless wolf packs, and cost virtually nothing to maintain, while conventional fences had been rebuilt 3 complete times. The stupid fence that settlers had mocked in 1872 had outlived most of the skeptics who had ridiculed it.